Well, thank you everyone for coming. Dr. Harbir Antil is the founder and director of the Center for Math and AI at George Mason University. He's held fellowship positions at Brown and the University of Delaware, and is the president of the SIAM, DC, Maryland, and Virginia section. Uh, he's going to he's going to be speaking to us today on optimization and high fidelity digital twins. Professor Antil, thank you very much for joining us today. Before we get started, one question: would you prefer to save questions to the end, or to have me raise them as you go?
As we go, it's better to make it more interactive. I'm fine with that. Yeah.
Okay, I will monitor Q&A and raise any questions that anyone asks. So, yeah, thank you very much for being here, and welcome.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Mark, for the kind invitation and this introduction. Really a great pleasure to meet all of you guys and share some of the research work we are doing in our center. So. Um, our work currently is supported by National Science Foundation, Office of Naval Research, and Air Force Office of Scientific Research. So here is a quite quick outline of my talk. I will start with, just a sort of a general notion of digital twins. What do I mean by that? And then I'm going to be focusing more on what I call the high fidelity digital twins, and I will describe what I mean by that. And you will notice that there are um, many challenges that comes along with these type of problems, in particular uncertainty, and I'll describe how one can account for that. And then depending on where we are in terms of time, I might get into more mathematical details and mathematical challenges. Again, also depends on your interest, through with the help of an example related to permeability optimization. And then I'll discuss some know, sort of uh, practical examples of the proposed approach, and and then I'll get into a bit more into AI and ML work that we have been doing, and I'll conclude with some results on neuromorphic computing, neuromorphic imaging. So I have a long list. I don't know if I can go through all of them, but let's see. So let's go back, around 55 years ago, and we have all heard the term Houston, we have a problem, right? Which was, there was a disaster in making at the Apollo module, and you can see the damage that had incurred. Now the question is, how did they actually manage to um come back to Earth safely? So what they did was they transmitted data from the um, module to Houston, and then they fed this data into simulators. They accounted for physics, and they were able to replicate whatever was happening with the module on the ground, and then they transmitted the solution back, which was the data again. So what we see here is that we have a physical asset, then we have data, which could be collected by sensors or something else. Then we have a digital model. In this case, actually, there was a real model, which was the simulators. And there was not just one simulator, but a family of simulators. Um, so you're combining data with physics to create a digital model. And then there is a feedback loop. So there is a kickback, right? There's an action. So this is what I mean by a digital twin. And for me, these are going to be optimization problems with constraints, and one may have to account for uncertainty, as I will describe shortly. What this needs is this topic for you to develop and really take off. You need, really strong collaboration between academia, national labs, and industry. All right, so let me get into some examples. So, some of you may remember in Minneapolis, there was a bridge disaster happening on I-35, I believe, in 2007, and we recently had one in Baltimore as well. And there was one in Italy in 2018. Again, several people died, unfortunately, and there was the most recent one in Dresden in Germany. So can we sort of prevent such disasters when it comes to our infrastructure? And the ideas that I'm going to talk about is not just limited to bridges, but they equally apply to, for example, dam. Here I have a picture of Hoover Dam, and I'll show you some simulations related to that later on. Or a special kind of bridge, the Infinity Bridge in UK, or this Concerto Bridge, which is in the lab of our collaborator at Technical University of Braunschweig, or this walkway bridge in Lithuania. Again, these ideas are not just limited to these structures, but it applies to buildings, it applies to nuclear reactor, and they also apply to medical digital twin, as I will describe shortly. So what do we want to do at first? So I want to go back, and then what we want to create is a digital model, right? In this case, basically the idea is you have placed some sensors here, then these sensor data come in, then you create a digital model, which is, for me, is a finite element model. I come up with the geometry in CAD, then I do discretization using finite element method. Here I am showing you, different type of discretizations. And let's focus a little bit more on this Concerto Bridge, because for this we can actually get a data from our collaborators. The challenge here is that you have concrete. So if you want to come up with the discretization of concrete, that's quite different than the discretization of tendons, for example, which are these red sort of bars in the interior. So first, what you want to do is you want to take the measurements, right? And there are different ways of measuring. You can place a sensor on the bridge itself, or you can use some kind of drones. And here I'm showing you 4 different type of measurements at the center of this bridge using 4 different ways, right? And there is a load that's applied at this point. That's why this is bending slightly. It's in millimeters. Um, Now we're going to use this data somehow and feed it into our digital model. And let's see how we do that. Let's talk about digital model at first. So we do discretization, for example, let's say using finite element method. And then we want to make sure that this digital model represent the reality. And here what we did was we, applied to our numerical solver, which is elasticity equation, certain load at this point, and then we saw that our numerical simulation can actually replicate um, sort of this behavior. Now the question is, can you combine this model that we come up with, for the bridge using elasticity equation with these sensor measurements, and to identify what are the weak spots on this bridge? And this, you can set it up as an optimization problem where you're trying to, match certain measurements. This could be the displacement or could be the stress. And the constraints are given by elasticity equations. And the goal is to identify the coefficient in your elasticity equation, the Young's modulus. So if this Young's modulus is close to 0, which means there is some weakness in that particular region on the bridge. If it's close to 1, then it's not weak. Basically, it's good enough. This is a joint work with several collaborators at GMU, a professor at Rainer Lerner, who is in physics, a PhD student, which we are co-advising, Professor Roland Wuchner from TU Munich, and another PhD student we are advising, Tala, and postdoc Sunath, and Ihar, who is a postdoc at TU Braunschweig. All right, so that's sort of a digital twin for us. Just to give you one precise example, we have a physical asset, we have measurements, we have a model, and then we set it up an optimization problem. Excuse me, sorry. And then the goal is to identify weak spots on the bridge from these sensor measurements. And we are interested in really the high fidelity digital twin. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that we don't want to, simplify our geometry to something like this. And we don't want global information, but we want actually local information. So we want to identify if there is a local crack or not, or formation of crack. So something like this on the top right panel, where you have the model of the actual structure, and we want to identify, local weakness. Many of these ideas are applicable to what we call the medical digital twins, right? So, and this is a really important area, and it has already seen, several benefits from using digital twins. So think about, preventative medicine. So, for instance, many people are suffering from um, diabetes, for instance. But nowadays they are, designing these devices which you can put under your arm. And what this device does it takes the measurements of your glucose level every few minutes or few seconds. Then in the background, it's solving sort of a differential equation, combining this data, and then it gives a feedback. And the feedback here is basically the insulin shot, right? So we already see like a really tangible example. The other potential use cases are clinical trials. Many times, we have rare diseases. How do you actually come up with enough people to test this medicine on? And we know we are all different. Many of us come from, different background. So there's a huge amount of diversity. So how do you actually have the enough sample space to test a particular medicine? So for that, you can create this virtual digital twin population to be able to, do this testing. So there are many, many examples like that. In particular, together with my colleague, Professor Lerner and Professor Juan Cibral and Dr. Fernando Mut, these guys are from bioengineering. We are looking into creating digital twins for aneurysms. And if you want to have like a general reference on this topic, I mentioned this article by Reinhard Lobenbacher from Florida. So that's all what I'm going to say about the medical digital twins. I'm happy to discuss more details on this topic as well. All right, so I already mentioned what I mean by high fidelity digital twins, but what could go wrong? What can go wrong is if you're not careful with the problem itself. So here, what we were trying to do was from these these are our sensor locations, and from these measurements, we were trying to identify the coefficient in my elasticity equation, which should be constant 1, which is, this red color. But our equation is actually a partial differential equation, so it's an infinite dimensional object. So if I do not, if I blindly apply a solver to that, I get a solution which is, looks like the one on the left, on the top left, which is, a random object, right? So what we need to make sure is once you are, coming up with solution to this type of problems, that you really account when you're designing solvers, you account for the fact that these are infinite dimensional objects. So you design the solvers which are structure preserving. And like many times we have uncertainty. For example, it could be uncertainty in the load. For instance, there may be too many vehicles passing on the bridge at a certain time, or there may be sort of gust of wind coming in. So how do you account for those scenarios? The one way to do this is by treating your load vector or your boundary conditions as random fields. But this makes your objective function that you're trying to minimize a random variable, and you cannot really minimize a random variable objective function. So instead, what you do is compute the expected value, right? And this is its own challenging because it leads to high dimensional optimization problems, because in the random variable the dimensions explode significantly. But this expectation also cannot account for the rare events, because many times you are really interested in the rare events. So one way to account for these rare events is to bring in some ideas from the finance. For instance, using the notion of so-called risk measure. An example of risk measure is what we call the average value at risk or conditional value at risk, which is the expected value of the tail of your distribution. Because many times your rare events or high consequence events may be hiding in the tail. So here I'm showing you an example where you have a damage which is localized that you want to identify, here marked in the dark blue color from the sensor measurements. And if you, for instance, if you use the standard expectation, you get this result, which is reasonable, but it's much more like a smeared out. Another question is, can you localize this using some of these ideas? And I'll show you some results that it is possible actually. In some of these problems, one should also account for thermal effects, and that has a significant impact on the load that you are applying, because these objects are not in vacuum, right? They are exposed to sun, snow, shadow. So how do you account for the thermal stresses? So that's something that we have also looked into recently. And then we're interested in the dynamic problems as well, and this leads to dynamic optimization problems where you may have you may know the state, let's say at the previous time, and you want to identify what the optimal state should be at the next time. And Zn is my design variable or my control variable that I'm trying to identify. So in the previous examples, this U correspond to the displacement in the elasticity equation, and Z corresponds to the Young's modulus that I need to identify. And they fulfill this, differential equation, right? So here I'm writing everything in the discrete sense. All right, so another advantage so basically what I'm trying to say is our framework that I was presenting before extends also to the dynamic optimization problems. And one example of a dynamic optimization problem is your neural networks, right? So you're given some inputs. So I'm writing a supervised learning problem. You're given some input xi, and you're trying to match with some output yi. And this F is some kind of machine. It could be a neural network with the layer functions given by these HIs. And E is some kind of metric. It could be your softmax cross entropy type function or some kind of least squares type function. And these HIs are connected, let's say, through this residual neural network. And I'm adding this connection YL minus one, and tau, I'm introducing some parameter, and this sigma is as we know is the activation function, and W and B are the weights and biases. The cool thing is that this can be thought as a forward Euler discretization of a nonlinear differential equation like that, and which means you can rewrite your problem in this framework. So it fits in all the problems that I described before, in the dynamic optimization problem that I described before. So one can use actually rigorous optimization schemes to solve these type of problems, right? And then so here are some references on this topic if you guys are interested. All right, so now I'm gonna, I do more mathematics, but I'm gonna put everything in an abstract framework. So all the problems that I discussed so far can be cast as a minimization of some objective function J, and U is my state variable. For the machine learning, U is like your feature vectors. Z is my design or control variable. For machine learning, Z corresponds to your weights and biases, and you have some constraints. So in machine learning context, these constraints are your neural network itself, or how the features are propagating. In case of the digital twins that I was talking about for structures, this C corresponds to elasticity equation, and Z corresponds to the Young's modulus. And if you have uncertainty in your coefficients, in your load, or in your boundary conditions, then your J becomes a random variable, and then you either minimize some kind of expectation. I'm advocating for, using this risk measure called conditional value at risk, for instance. And if you do that, actually, so let's go back to the same example. So I'm, instead of minimizing the standard expectation, which give me this result like that, I'm now accounting for rare events and then using this CUR, where this beta is the parameter that you can tune. So larger beta means you're more and more conservative. So for beta equals 0.8, I get a result like this, which is much more localized, and it's much better result. So these approaches, work very well once if you have some idea about the behavior of uncertainty. But in many times we don't know what the distribution is, what the underlying distribution is. Now think of your machine learning problem. If you knew what the distribution is, then you do not have to minimize this empirical risk. You can directly minimize the original risk. So that's the fundamental question when it comes to machine learning. So to actually account for this fact that we do not know the underlying distribution, that there is maybe ambiguity in your underlying distribution, there may be corruption in your training data. Together with my former postdoc, Sean Carney, who is now a professor at Union College, Hugo Diaz, who is a former PhD student, who is a postdoc at NC State, and Professor Johannes Royset from University of Southern California. We have developed this notion of Rockefellian relaxation. This actually really helps when it comes to corruption in your distribution or in your training data. It goes in and kills those corruption. So I hope more people will use it. This article is available on arXiv and currently under review. All right, so basically, so far what we have discussed is, I started with the definition of this digital twins, and then I briefly discussed what I mean by high fidelity digital twin, that we are interested in, identifying. We're interested in using high fidelity models, and also interested in identifying local weakness in structure. And then I briefly discussed, medical digital twins. And then I jumped into, some of the challenges when it comes to such problems, that, these are really infinite dimensional optimization problems. So when you design solvers, you have to account for that. These problems may contain uncertainty. So you could minimize the expectation, or you may want to look into something more sophisticated like these risk measures. And then I talked about, these dynamic optimization problems, which encompass your neural networks. So all the solvers that I'm designing for this, abstract problems, they do apply, directly to your neural network training problems. In fact, that's how I train my neural networks, because we have our own code base for doing these things. I don't know how I'm doing, Mark, on time.
You're doing fine. We can run till 1 o'clock if you run a little over.
Okay. So basically, what I want to emphasize now, on depending on the interest, is some of the nitty-gritty that goes in behind the scene when it comes to such optimization problems. So I'm going to go through just one particular example. We were trying to design a device where you are injecting fluid at this boundary, and fluid is coming out from this boundary. And this is a joint project with the folks at Sandia National Lab. And we assume the fluid follow this so-called Darcy flow, where U is the velocity, P is the pressure, kappa is the permeability function, and mu is a given dynamic viscosity parameter. And the velocity basically is divergence free, which is the conservation of mass, that there are no source or sinks inside the domain. And the goal is that we want to make sure that the fluid follows certain principles, that it remains mass conserving, and it follows certain streamlines And if you inject certain particles with the fluid, let's say inject two particles at the same time, they should also exit at the same time, which I call the uniform transit principle. And you can cast this problem as an optimization problem where you want to, enforce all those requirements on a desired velocity UD. This is the Darcy pressure, and here I have rewritten this equation in in a in a in the divergence form. And our optimization variable in this case is this kappa, which is my permeability function. So you want to design the permeability field so you attain a sort of a desired flow pattern in your device. So, and similar sort of problem is what we discussed when I talked about these digital twins previously. There is a lot of um, analytical details in the background. The idea, the main gist is that you do not directly work with this form of equation, but you write the so-called weak formulation. And since my device is axisymmetric, so I'm going to map this to a two-dimensional domain and work in the cylindrical coordinates. And then eventually I will just rotate it to get the solution in the entire 3D domain. So that's what this corresponds to. One interesting thing is that we want to make sure that my equation is solvable. For this, I need to make sure that this function kappa, it does not touch zero. That's why I enforce certain constraints on it as well. So then there are, some analytical challenges when it comes to, showing the existence of solution to such problems. The traditional approaches, which comes from homogenization theory that engineers use quite a bit actually in practice, that does not work. So we motivate our approach from topology optimization point of view to introduce another differential equation which helps us improve the smoothness of the underlying functions, and that does the trick basically. Eventually, we get this so-called filtered optimization problem, and you can show this problem as a solution. And then we show that our objective functional is sufficiently smooth that we can use Newton's type method to solve the problem. So as you can see, there are lots of math if you're interested in doing that, and in the background. That was the purpose of the slide, not to overwhelm you guys. And here, what I'm trying to do is, I want to make sure that the flow follows these dotted streamlines. And the color one is the result from our optimization routine. The one on the right corresponds to the permeability field that we have designed. So this is something the engineers can actually do 3D printing of, and then you can make the device do whatever you want. So that was a bit of a digression, more on the mathematical point of view. But let me go back to the problems that I was discussing before. Does this actually work in practice, these ideas? And they do. That's why I'm here. Let's go back to the concerto bridge example that I was showing you. And here I use the data that I showed you before, right, where we apply the load in a certain part, and then we put these measurements into our optimization problem, and then we solve our problem using the so-called adjoint optimization framework. Then we noticed in our code that we have, the two spots, there is potential weakness. So the blue corresponds to the Young's modulus, which is close to 0. Red corresponds to something close to 1. And then we were wondering if actually there are any such weak spots on the bridge or not. So then this postdoc we are working with at TU Braunschweig, he went out and looked at the actual bridge. And these were the two of those locations. And once you zoom in, you do see actually there is a crack forming at precisely the location that we predicted from our approach. And here also, it's a very small crack, but it does appear on the left side as well. So, which is quite remarkable, especially for a person like me who does math most of the times, that these approaches actually do work in practice quite well. We are also, collaborating with Siemens, where these guys are, one of the projects they're interested in is wind turbines, and they've given us, this geometry and this so-called finite element mesh, and from the sensor measurements, which are these white dots, the goal is to identify weakness in these structures. And this is the result from our approach. It does a fairly good job, actually. We are looking into the dynamic optimization problems as well, as I mentioned before. And this is a work in progress, and it seems to work quite well, actually, that we can, if there are structures which are changing dynamically um, rather quickly, then you can actually create digital twins for these problems as well. We can also account for thermal effects, as I mentioned at the beginning, that one of the big challenges, how do you account for the thermal effects? Because bridge or dam or a reactor may be heated unevenly, right? Um, so the idea is to account for thermal stresses, and then in this case, you don't solve just for the Young's modulus, but you also invert for the temperature difference or the thermal loads to create your digital twins. Currently, we are looking into, trying to create these digital twins in space. That requires more sophisticated technology, even using the so-called direct simulation Monte Carlo type methods. And this is a sort of work in the progress. Or designing heat shields, for vehicles like that. This is a joint work ongoing currently with the postdoc Keegan Kirk and Alex Kaltenbach from Berlin. All right, so we have created a digital twin lab. Yeah, I'm showing you some of the people who are involved from physics, from bioengineering, um, from structure engineering, from labs, and this is supported by Sandia National Lab, Siemens, and funded by Air Force. All right, just some references on this part of the talk. Basically, we have created optimization-based digital twin framework. We carry out structure-preserving discretizations. There may be uncertainty in the problems. We know how to tackle that, and we validated our results against some real experiments. Right. So let me, in 5 minutes or so, talk a little bit more about some of the efforts ongoing in the data ML type of work that we are doing. So what we are interested in is design of neural network architectures, and I will get into a little more details on this on the next slide. But we really want to understand what is the mathematics behind this neural network training, for instance. So I mentioned at the beginning that you can think of your residual neural networks as a discretization of ODEs, which is, not an entirely new idea, but people in neural ODEs are thinking in those directions. What we are doing differently is we think of these problems as really constraint optimization problems and use the technology, basically adjoint-based methods to derive your backpropagation gradients or higher order optimization algorithms to solve these problems. One thing that we are doing differently than most people, another thing we are doing differently than most people is, we enforce in each layer that these biases are monotonically increasing. And this is very easy to enforce in your training itself. You don't need to solve a nonlinear program or a nonlinear optimization problem, but you can easily do this in Torch or in TensorFlow by adding another regularization. We have noticed that this has a significant impact on the training, actually, that because your original optimization problem is so non-convex, it helps convexify the problem a little bit, and it's just a simple sort of tuning. We have developed a complete analysis for some of these residual type neural networks because your activation function, for instance, ReLU is not differentiable. So most of the times, people just close their eyes, honestly. But I think we wanted to really understand what the real mathematics behind this. This is published in this article. We are looking into this so-called spiky neural networks as well, but that's for a different occasion. One thing that we wanted to understand was, can you and actually capture algorithms using neural networks? And the way we went about this is, you can represent a constant function using a neural network, using a Heaviside function. Um, it can be just a one neuron or two neurons. You can represent a linear function using ReLU and Heaviside, or two ReLU. And you can represent higher order polynomials in a similar way. And then we were looking at this, let's say ODE, and we write an integrator, which is, Ford-Euler scheme, for instance, here. And you can actually represent this algorithm, right? And I'm not trying to approximate the solution to the ODE, to the differential equation, but I'm trying to capture the algorithm, just the Ford-Euler scheme using a neural network. And you can do that, actually. It's fairly easy. And in this case, actually, so this is the residual block, and the rest blocks are known to us, and we actually know what the weights and biases are explicitly. And this residual block, there may be another neural network in the interior, right? So this is a first order method, but you can do the same thing for higher order RK2 or Rangekota type order 2 or higher order methods. And you can see the number of layers are increasing. And we know the actual weights and biases in all cases. So you may ask me, where do you think this could be useful? This could be useful in designing other type of integrators, which are not known at the moment. This could be useful on when it comes to this so-called edge computing, where you're limited by resource and you have to do computing as one specific type of calculation over and over again. Okay, in the last couple of minutes, I will talk a little bit about another topic that we are very much interested in these days, is the so-called neuromorphic imaging, which is related to neuromorphic computing. So if you think about a standard camera, it registers intensity at all the pixels, right? But this may be redundant when it comes to, like, let's say you point your camera to a wall, then you're capturing the same image over and over again, which is quite redundant. So instead, what we are interested in doing is designing a sensor which only captures the change. So if Q, X, Y, Sj is the intensity of this pixel Q at rotation XY at time Sj, and this is the bottom, the intensity at the previous time of the same pixel, then if this ratio is 1, then log of 1 is 0, then do not register anything. If this is greater than equal to some camera threshold C, then you register the intensity as +1. If it's less than equal to -C, you register the intensity as -1. So basically, you're registering these spikes, blue +1, red -1, instead of the actual picture, which is this panel shown here at the bottom left figure. So as you can see, because the data is so sparse, so you can afford to sample at a very fine scale, at a microsecond level, and instead of these frames, which can be quite expensive to store, especially if you're limited by power and memory, which is the case in several scenarios. And you do see more information, especially this person was shaking this pillow, and we ran this data through our algorithm that we have designed together with the former PhD student, David Sayer. We can see the thumb of this person, for instance, which was not visible here, right? And we have, we also work together with Dr. Jeff McHarg from USEFA, where these guys actually have sent one of these sensors to the International Space Station. And now the idea was to do reconstruction from this image data set, this neuromorphic data set. And we have designed an algorithm to do that. And we can actually, so the left panel here corresponds to our results, and the right one corresponds to their approach. And we seem to be doing better than what they can do at the moment. All right. So, and the last, uh, so example is basically, which is the most recent paper, where we are doing the dynamic reconstructions just from the event data set or this neuromorphic data set. Here, somebody decide to take an aim at a cup, and we can actually capture the dynamics remarkably well with such small amount of data. So we have established another lab, so-called the neuromorphic computing lab, and we have real sensors in the lab, which allows you to create your own data. So I think that's all what I wanted to say. So thank you for your attention.